Well, welcome everyone, and thanks for attending this MS365Con 2021 focus session, sponsored by Martello. Martello's digital experience monitoring solutions provide monitoring analytics on the performance and user experience of critical cloud business applications, while giving IT teams and service providers control and visibility of their entire IT infrastructure. Martello's products include Microsoft 365 End User Experience Monitoring, Unified Communications Performance Analytics, and IT Service Analytics. Martello Technologies is headquartered in Ottawa, Canada, with employees in Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific region. Our speakers for this session are Olivier Reynaud and Rob Doucette. Rob Doucette is Martello's Vice President of Product Management. He has more than 15 years of experience building marketing-driven solutions with a focus on real-time diagnostics, monitoring, and analytics. He's assembled multiple software development teams from scratch and managed executive-level partnerships and relationships, and has helped to secure funding from Microsoft. I'm sure that's no easy task. Olivier Reynaud is Martello's Vice President of Client Delivery, with over 12 years of experience providing end-user monitoring solutions with a strong focus on Microsoft 365 technologies and skills with Microsoft hybrid platforms. Olivier's experience spans different roles within the DEM market, developing and maintaining close contact with enterprise clients and partners throughout. I encourage everyone to use the question panels to submit any questions or comments you have during today's presentations, and any questions that our speakers are not able to get to before we have to conclude this session will be shared with them to follow up with you by email after today's conference. And with that, I will now turn it over to Rob.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger. Thanks, everyone, for joining today's webinar. Just quick housekeeping to go over the agenda today. So we're going to kick things off with providing some context around Microsoft Teams. It's been an exciting year or so for Microsoft in terms of the explosive growth that we've seen with Teams. So we wanted to share a little bit of data that we had around that. And then we're going to spend the bulk of the webinar talking about how we can troubleshoot Microsoft 365 problems. We're going to go through a few examples, going from global to regional to specific user problems with demos throughout, and then wrap it up with a little discussion and demo around service management and how we can tie all this back to an SLA and XLA. So from a context perspective, monitoring and management around digital experiences such as Microsoft Teams is now becoming mission critical. As these services are delivered from the cloud, control and visibility is lost from the IT teams, and new tools are needed to be able to stay productive. We're seeing that a lot of businesses have now made plans for permanent remote work, right? So as a result of the global pandemic, many of us were thrust into our homes, but this is now shaping up to be a permanent way of life going forward. And as a result, we need new capabilities to make sure that when your employees are on less reliable networks in their homes, they can still be productive with digital experiences like Microsoft Teams. Massive surges of growth through the last 12 months with Microsoft Teams. And then interesting statistic we've got here around the number of organizations and initiatives that are requiring reporting on digital user experience. So we're seeing a lot of growth where right up to the CIO level, understanding how well these digital experiences are being delivered to your users and employees is becoming really important. A couple more metrics on the growth, right? We're now seeing more than 1 million enterprises using Microsoft 365, and really Teams is underpinning a lot of that growth, where we're seeing 50% growth over a very short period of time through the pandemic. And roughly, Microsoft is keeping up with a pace of around 3 million users added each month, which is phenomenal, given that it's already a sizable base of users. So with that, we're going to pass it off to Olivier here and talk about troubleshooting specific problems with Microsoft 365.
Thank you, Rob. So that's what we thought about, like showing really the problem ID card throughout the different examples that we're going to take, and examples of incidents that are real and that you're going to face, or you've most likely already faced with Office 365. There's still problems that need to be troubleshot the same way. So you need to identify the problem through making assumptions and validating those assumptions. But at the end, what you're looking to identify is, well, what that problem really is. What is the symptoms? What are the actions impacted, the applications impacted, really the what is happening. You want to know the who, like who are the users in your organization that are impacted by this problem. You want to know when, so when it started, when it ended, the duration, have a specific timeline of that event. And typically what we see is, depending on the type of event, this is going to change throughout the time of the incident. And you want to know where. We, as Rob explained earlier, not only you have offices that are across the globe, but most likely you have users that are now in even more locations than before because they might be working from the office or most likely in those times working remotely. So we're going to use that ID card throughout the examples to see what you can do natively. We're going to give you some tips and tricks and tools to use to come up to those conclusions. And we'll show you what you can find with the Martello solutions. So whenever you have that type of problem, the first thing is always reproducing the problem. As we said, making assumptions, validating the hypothesis that you make. Once you have identified a problem and you have this ID card, you want to make sure you provide solutions. So communicate, all the impacted users how to face this problem, which means ideally providing the solutions, or that can be working around it. Sometimes you just can't resolve it right away, or it's not under your direct control. That doesn't mean that the end users are not waiting for your guidance on what to do. And finally, when the problem is over, it's not really over for your team and yourself. Most likely you want to plan for the future, how to prevent this type of issue, and we'll see like what type of specific recommendation we can make. So we're going to be looking at 3 specific use cases. First, we'll take the example of a global outage, something that impacts all of your users. We'll take a look at a regional issue, so something that is scoped to only a subset of your locations and users. And finally, we'll take an example at the most granular type of problem, which is specific users, when one or more users are complaining about a problem. So let's jump into the global outage. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's take a look at what the symptom is. Well, it's all of your users in your tenant are having issues with Microsoft 365. So as an example, they're rare, but they happen. And mid-March, there was an example like that that impacted probably your tenant as well, because that was a global outage throughout the world. And really, there's a lot of different impacts. It's pretty hard to understand that this is happening, and we're going to see how you can determine that. But the impacts are huge because, well, global productivity might be impacted. Office 365 or Microsoft 365, as we call it now, it is most likely your biggest investments and a platform that is used by all your business units. So when it's not working as expected, this is going to directly impact your business. There's a big risk of shadow IT. Your end users still need to get this done at the end of the day. They still need to reach out to other users, to clients. They need to be able to communicate, exchange files. They're going to find a way. And if it's not something you recommended, they're still going to find their own. And last but not least, especially in global outage, we see that many companies go through a ticket surge where a lot of the users are starting to create tickets, and it's just this never ending because you don't have direct control, and unless you communicate anything, those tickets are just going to accumulate. So if we take a look at what you get natively, so Microsoft has done a pretty good job at providing this service health dashboard in your portal. It will gather all of the workloads that are available within your tenant, and will provide those advisories. They're not real time, but we can say with certainty that all the previous Microsoft outages have been published, usually within the hour, about like 15 to 30 minutes after the start time, usually. You can also go on Twitter. That was very useful during some of the past outages, because if you can't access the portal because there's a problem with the authentication, well, the only thing left is something besides that. So the Twitter account is pretty reactive, and they'll give you the incident number you can then keep track back in the portal. So what does this really allow you to do is, if we look at our ID card, you'll understand what services are impacted. So typically Microsoft will say, well, your Teams users might be impacted, or all of the Microsoft 365 services might be impacted. That was the case during the last outage. They mentioned that most your users may be experiencing problem with Microsoft 365 services. You don't really know who, so that's really hard because your users may or may not be impacted. You will have the start time of the incident and when they created the incident, and you won't really know where. So what can you do in that type of context? Well, most likely you have some test accounts. If not, definitely we recommend to create some. If this is something that impacts your entire tenant, your own user should be impacted, and it would be great to test with another test account. Microsoft provides the remote connectivity analyzer as well. That's a great tool that you can use. It was designed more for configurations, changes that you make, and ensuring that your auto discover works good, each of the actions of the workload. But that can be a great tool to use when you spot some problems within your organization. And obviously all the network tests, so running some ping, trace routes, ideally TCP pings would be great to do. That allows you to understand if there's something on the network layer. Not as good for testing the application layer though, so that's why you want to have the test account. No matter what the problem is, you want to communicate about it. This is really something that is difficult to do, especially when you're leveraging SaaS services, but you want to make sure that you communicate that to your teams, to the end users at the earliest that you can. So once you have confirmation of the Microsoft problem, you must have a few tests and a few users reporting the issue. You can start communicating on that problem, and depending on what is not available, you should provide some workarounds on some other applications that end users should be leveraging that will help preventing the shadow IT, as well as minimizing the number of tickets that are going to be created by end users. Once the issue is fully resolved, you want to do a postmortem analysis. Within typically 3 to 5 business days, Microsoft will provide a postmortem analysis on their side that will clearly outline what took place and what were the impact and incidents and how they recovered. You want to make sure that you go through that and you analyze that for yourself, making sure you had all the tools at least manually to trigger, ideally automated, and document some procedures to face those global outages in the future. So now we're going to take a look at, well, what if you had the tools that Martello provides you with in order to capture those types of incidents? So here is a view of one of our components within the solution. So we have the ability to do synthetic transactions to test the service of your tenant from multiple locations. This is done 24/7, typically every 5 minutes or so, and that will effectively test your tenant just like your users are using the services. So testing Exchange, Teams, OneDrive, SharePoint, and so on. And not just checking the endpoint, but really performing in-depth actions, trying to send a mail, create a meeting, chat with another user, upload a document, anything you can think of. And that really provides you the right visibility in what is happening throughout the different locations. And we'll look at the ID card just after, but you can already see how I can see my various locations and understand where I have big problems that are happening, either real time or historically throughout the past days, week, month, or the past year. And while this provides a great level of visibility to look at the trend, you also have real-time dashboards that are really helping with understanding what is happening right now. So this is a typical example where, yes, we have issues happening right now. You can see immediately what workload, you can see the locations, and you can see how bad the impact is. So that's really something that you want to have ideally because you'll have real-time visibility on anything that is happening. I couldn't cause a real Microsoft outage. I'm not that influent yet, but we have some screenshots from what happened during the last one, mid-March. And this is what you would have seen. So similar to the use cases I presented, you would see the real-time statuses and be able to click and drill down. And also you could look at it real time. And as Microsoft was working through the issue and restoring the services, there was still some degradation, but you could see clearly, well, yes, there was a big degradation on some of the actions. You can see exactly when that came back, and that for each of the workload. So if we take a look at that ID card, well, you can see we immediately identify what is impacted. So for our tenant, we've seen that Teams and OneDrive were impacted. It was mostly the authentication for Teams that was not working anymore, so all of the Teams actions were impacted. For OneDrive and SharePoint, we could access the sites, but all of the document upload and download and access was not working anymore. So we clearly identify what. We could know immediately that all the tenant users were impacted because all the robots were. We knew exactly at what time it started. And we knew that all of the locations were impacted because this was a tenant-wide issue. So really, the reproducing the problem becomes easy because the robots are constantly testing the services users. You can then easily provide solutions because you have updates on the problem, you have this real time, and can make updates as the problem evolves and as the services are restored. It's also easing the post-mortem analysis because you'll have all the historical dashboard and key metrics to keep track of before the incident happened, during the incident, and as the various impacts were occurring. And this is also a really big reason why you want to have some syntax transactions. We're going to see in some other problems like why some role user monitoring is key, but here the syntax transactions are constantly watching the problem and provide you the ability to catch anything that is happening and keep track of it. Even if no user is yet impacted, if no one is awake in your offices throughout the world, you will cache the information thanks to that.
Yeah, I think it's a great differentiator compared to some of the websites or tools out there that might be pinging these endpoints and trying to kind of produce the same level of information, but they really don't have the context in terms of the specific things users might be able to do within those outages. So it's very interesting.
Exactly. So I'll pass it on to Rob.
Thanks, Olivier. So now that we've seen what a global outage looks like in the case where there's a Microsoft-centric problem, the reality is most of the time it's not Microsoft, right? It's easy to sort of say, yeah, Teams was slow and it must be something with Microsoft. The reality is most of the time Teams, as well as the other applications and services within Microsoft 365, run quite smoothly and deliver great performance. So, what other problems can we look at that might be explaining why somebody might have a poor performance for Teams? And we see that, statistics show that 90% of the issues that most enterprises face are with their own infrastructure and/or network. So let's move into a regional issue here and better understand how would we go through the same thought process that Olivier just walked us through at a global scale, what this looks like from regional perspective. So the symptoms here are going to look very, very similar to what we just saw with the global use case, right? Where we're going to have one or more users that are complaining, that are saying that they've got some poor Teams calls or experiences. Users are frustrated, right? It impacts productivity. Help desk is struggling to answer because they don't really know at this point. Is it just a couple of users that are having problems? Is it a global outage? Is it specific to a region? We really don't know yet, what the scope of the problem is. And again, much like Olivier outlined in the global outage problem, the steps that we're going to follow are very similar. So we're going to try and use a test account and connect in various locations to try and see if it is isolated to one region. We're going to use some of the tools that Microsoft provides. We're going to use some of the network capabilities we can do to see what's going on. But you can see that the difference or the comparison between the global and the regional, the steps are very similar because we're going through the same troubleshooting steps trying to figure out the scope of the problem. So it's very difficult to figure that out. We end up not really knowing what has happened. All we know in terms of who is impacted are the users who reported the issue. For all we know, there's many other users that are experiencing issues as well, but maybe they're not reporting this issue. They haven't really, fully felt the impact of this issue yet. We don't know when it started or even when it's going to end. And we don't really know where it's happening besides, making some judgment calls based on where the users were that were complaining. So, but if we had a couple of users complaining in different regions, it's going to be quite challenging to isolate if this is a regional problem or, again, a global issue. Again, I'll reinforce what Olivier said on the global point. We certainly want to keep the communication channels open. But in this case, we end up sort of having to take a brute force approach where we might have to end up communicating this to a larger group of users than we wish, users that might not have any impact at all, because we don't really know who's impacted and who's not. So I'm going to pass the baton back to Olivier.
Thank you, Rob. So indeed, the regional issue is really tough to troubleshoot, I find, because as you mentioned, there's some users complaining, but it's often scoped. It can be scoped to a location because of the network, to maybe the front door they connect to an ISP. It's really hard to understand. You want to have some metrics that are helping you capture. So what I'm showing here is what you've seen just earlier for the global outage. That would be the same dashboard you'd be looking at real time. The great thing here is, as we mentioned earlier, well, here you wouldn't see all of the location being impacted. Here we've simulated this use case. You can see I have some impacts in my organization on Teams, on OneDrive, some degradation on Exchange, and you can see directly here, well, in Bangalore, there seems to be a lot of problems with the Teams MUS scores, and if you click here, we'll directly give you, okay, well, yes, you have critical issues on Teams. They're happening on Paris. The MUS score for the calls is under 3.5, and same in Bangalore. And you can then drill down and look if it's something that's specific to Teams. You look at the Teams dashboard and understand each of the location, what is happening right now, what has been the case in the past 1 hour, or drill down more. And you can understand with granularity what the impact is. So like we looked at earlier, sorry, here you would see what are the actions impacted. So we don't just ping the endpoint or make a voice call, we really test all the actions if we take the example of Teams. So that really helps and provides the help desk team to answer to the ticket. If some users are complaining, you always want to validate the service first, the service that's being delivered to the various locations. And this is what the Martello robots will give you, and that Gizmo interface will allow your team to say, yes, there is a problem with their service. We're aware of it. It started at 7 p.m. Eastern time, and we're working on it. It might be different types of problems, and this is what Rob is going to show you. Thanks to our other component, we can look at specific places and understand exactly where the problem lies when there's an impact on the service. So I'll pass it on back to Rob.
Thanks, Olivier. So I wanted to highlight another component of our Martello DEM solution here, which we call Active Network Path Monitoring. And really what this is doing is visualizing the route between your users or locations and the Microsoft data center that they're trying to access. In this case, we're showing access into Teams. So I'm going to group this data. So here's the route between, in this case, John and the Teams data center. And I can group this to see among those hops between John and the Microsoft data center, who owns those hops and where is the problem occurring. And here we can see that the jitter is starting within John's ISP. So we know right away that the issue is not a one-off user issue just with John. We know everything seems to be okay from a Microsoft perspective in this region, but we know that there's an ISP problem. And so we now immediately have quite a bit more intel to understand that anybody who might be using this ISP may also be seeing the same type of problem as John. So back to our problem ID card, we can see that we have quite a bit more information now by using the combination of those two components within our DEM solution. We know specifically that the problem was isolated to Teams. We know that all users who were using that ISP, in this case it was tech-savvy, in that region will be affected. So we know we can be proactive with communication for those users. We know exactly when the problem was happening. We know where the problem was happening in the Ottawa region. So we're able to have a much better grasp on the problem and be very efficient in terms of who we're going to reach out to, who we're going to communicate, and the actions we take after that point. So now let's take a look at a user-specific problem. This is a different use case where the starting point may look very similar in that we hear about this from one user. The troubleshooting steps we mentioned earlier still apply. But let's take a look at this in details. Olivier, did you want to take this slide?
Yes, thanks, Rob. So yes, we've seen, often, unless you have monitoring tools in place, like what Martello provide, it's really going to be the user reaching out and opening a ticket. And this one is really hard because you'll have a specific user calling on some problems of some performance, similar to what we mentioned earlier. And it's always hard because it's going to be like my calls are bad or my OneDrive is slow, and they rarely come with an exact time and measurement of the impact. So the same impacts really are there, like user frustration, the productivity is impacted. It might be just in the scope of that user, but you still don't know, right? Because you only know that this user reached out to you and explained that problem. So what we want to go through here is, well, you validate that, this is not the service and it's the context of that particular user. And this is really hard to know, especially now in this world where a lot of your users, if not all of them, are working remotely. So if we take a look on the next slide, we can see that we still have this ID card. What really you get from the user that is opening the ticket? Well, it's going to be, yes, it's related to Teams calling. Is that all? You don't really know. John opened the ticket. Is it the only one experiencing the issue? You still don't know. He's saying about this morning. Well, what time did it really started? You still don't know. And John is in Ottawa. Okay, but who else is impacted? What Ottawa office is? So it's really hard. You have a few things. We took the example of Teams calling. You obviously have the call quality dashboard that can allow you to look at a specific Teams call. You can access that call and take a look. But you still don't know what else in the context is really happening, and it's only focusing on particular calls that you need to go and access knowing the exact time. So obviously still the same things as before. You can use a test account, hopefully from the same location as John. Really, those problems are hard to work through. More often than not, we see a lot of companies, those tickets about performance issues are just sitting there until they can be closed, but they're rarely resolved. So really what you want to do here is be able to understand exactly what is taking place for that user and access the metrics directly. So we're going to take a look at the demo to show you how Martello would show you specific metrics about the user and allow you to immediately understand, yes, there is an issue impacting John, and here's what it is.
Perfect. So we're going to jump into Martello IQ, and this is the aggregate view of all the data sources that we've been touching on. We talked a bit about the Microsoft synthetic transactions that Olivier showed, where we get insights into very specific actions that users take, as well as the network path information. And we also have quite a bit of detailed information around Teams call quality data, and it all gets aggregated and presented into this interface here. And so there's a couple examples I'm just going to quickly walk through. And one is, we've been talking about John and the problems that John has been having, and we can quickly find John in here. If I start typing his name, we can find him in this list and drill in and start looking at, first we see all the devices that he's using across the networks that he's accessing. We can see that at the moment, everything seems to be functioning quite well for him, at least recently. We see there's a couple alerts that have occurred, some meetings that he's had earlier last month. But we can also go back up to this top view here. We'll find a user that is having some problems. We see that in France here, we're detecting that there are some end user facing problems. So I'm going to drill in here and drill into, take a look at Rosa here. We see there's been all sorts of alerts with Rosa. And if we take a look here, we see that same view that I just showed with John. We see there's a number of devices that Rosa is using. We can see that in this case here, everything seems to be healthy from a Windows device on a wired connection. If I look at the one that's colored as a problem, it's the same device, but we see it's using a wireless network. So, that already gives us some clues that perhaps this is just isolated to the type of network that this user is connecting on, and we can suggest, that she uses the same network where we're getting good experiences. We get quite a bit of information here as well in terms of what devices are being used, headset, video devices, the call logs that are happening. So we get quite a bit of information to be able to understand and respond specifically to a particular user complaint and give them very specific information about what we can do about it. So again, coming back to the ID card, we can understand, exactly who's impacted to which extent. We know what time it happened because we can see from the call log when these poor calls were happening. And we have even additional layer of information beyond this that gives us the context in terms of understanding what are we going to do to fix this problem. And right, that might be a headset problem, a wired versus Wi-Fi problem, and we can be very proactive with how we handle this specific user complaint instead of, you know, the typical response, which might be, you know, waiting around until the next time that this problem happens, which, you know, just further, I think, frustrates the user because it seems like it's this, you know, hamster wheel of running into a problem, trying to get a resolution, and it's constantly back to, well, let me know the next time the problem happens, because when we try and gather, you know, network testing information at the time after the user has complained, oftentimes this issue has, you know, is no longer occurring, so it's very difficult to diagnose.
Yes, it's those famous intermittent issues, right? It's well, let me know when you have the problem, and we'll measure it. And it's really hard. So
exactly.
And I like what you showed here, Rob, and just to reinforce, what is really important is always to work the problem down. You want to make sure you're looking at the service. So what we looked at earlier, understanding, is the service really being delivered globally? Yes, no. Then is it delivered to that location? Yes or no? And then go down at the user level, like Rob showed here in this great example. And this is the way that you want to work through any problem that are impacting your services. And really, it becomes, once you have all that solution in place, this procedure, it's really about managing those problems, which really means managing the service. And if you followed some of our previous discussions, it's really a shared responsibility when you go to the cloud, because even though the service comes out of the Microsoft data center, you're still the one responsible for that service towards your end user, and you're effectively the one managing the service. It became hard because you don't have visibility on each of the data center and infrastructure inside the cloud, but you are still responsible for how it's being delivered to the user. And so really it's about managing the service, and you must be familiar with the service level agreements, and that is something that you need to put in place. Not just negotiate with Microsoft, but also internally make sure that you have visibility on the SLA of the various services that you provide to the different end users. And now that we're talking SLA, there's even XLA, but I'll let Rob show you and discuss about that.
Perfect. Yeah, so as Olivier just mentioned, you know, SLAs have been around for a long time, a term that most people understand well. But it's largely just about measuring pure availability or uptime. You know, Microsoft publishes the SLAs for the Microsoft components within Microsoft 365, which, you know, largely represent that those components are available from within the context of the Microsoft data centers where they're hosted, but it doesn't provide you visibility into how well this is being delivered to your end users. So if we look at some examples here, you know, we can start to take a look at, from the user perspective, that's really the key element of an XLA or an experience level agreement, is measuring not just that the team service was available from a Microsoft perspective, but how well are your users or employees able to take advantage and use that service. Because, you know, regardless of what the SLA might be on the Microsoft side, as Olivier said, your mission is to make sure that your users have performant access to these services so that they can be productive. So there's a few different ways that we can look at calculating this, whether it's just looking at the availability that the users were able to access the service and subtracting any downtime that they've had. But, you know, ultimately what we want to make sure that what we capture is, you know, latency, outages, the connectivity problems, some of the things that we've already touched on today, whether those are ISP related, wired versus Wi-Fi related, a user's faulty headset. Lots of different factors that come into play in order to construct an experience level agreement. So with all that said, how can we measure and maintain an XLA with Microsoft 365? You know, as I just mentioned, we really need that true end-to-end visibility that captures the user's local network and their endpoint. It captures the location of where that user might be or their own local Wi-Fi network. What's the connectivity like, not only within their own home or office, but connectivity to the ISP. We hear more and more from a routing perspective, you know, SASE providers, cloud proxies, VPNs, even though some of these things aren't necessarily recommended by Microsoft, they're often in use and can have an impact. So, having visibility into those things are also very important to produce an XLA. And, some of the technologies that you would need to understand in order to have that end-to-end view are some of the things that we touched on today. So synthetic transactions are an important piece of that. Understanding, 24/7 on a frequent interval, how well those applications are being delivered to your users. From a real user monitoring perspective, we took a look at being able to get to the specific details of a user, how well their actual calls are happening. And then the network path piece, understanding all the pieces in between the user and the Microsoft data center. All of those pieces are critical. They must function in tandem for the service to be adequately delivered to your users. So let's take a quick look at what that looks like back in Martello IQ. And I'm going to get back up to our business services view here where we started. And instead of looking at the French users, we're going to look at Canada this time. And I've got the Canadian users modeled in my organization here. And I've broken it down by end user, application, and infrastructure. Again, keeping in mind that to get this XLA, we need a real end-to-end perspective. So within this application perspective, we have Gizmo feeding the synthetic transactions that Olivier demoed earlier in the presentation. We also see the live statuses as reported by Microsoft. So if there is an issue that Microsoft is reporting, I can quickly go in here and see what that is and what the details are. And then if I jump back out, I'll switch over into the infrastructure view. And here I can get details about office locations. So here I'm monitoring the VPN. I'm also monitoring my Cisco infrastructure that is between me and the edge of my office before I get to the internet. So this is really important to understand as well. And I can even get these graphical views, browse into the integrated routers, see if VPN is healthy, quite a bit of information from the infrastructure perspective, which still is an essential part, even in the case of a pure SaaS service like Teams. Often if you're in a location or office, there's some network infrastructure there that must work for you to get access to that service. And then last but not least, we have the end user perspective. And here's where we see, actual users and what does their experience look like. And I won't spend a lot of time here. We kind of touched a bit on this already with different users, but here I can see what are the combinations of users and devices that I'm using, how well are those working, how many calls are happening, how many calls are failing, all that sort of thing. Now, all of that contributes into this SLA, which really is evolving into an XLA because we're getting the true end-to-end perspective here, where I can get a complete picture in terms of how well are my Canadian users able to access Microsoft 365 services. And in the bottom here, we see, details in terms of, when were these impacts happening? What can I do about them? Those sort of things are really important where I can understand how well this service is being delivered for a particular month. And I can go, backwards and forwards in time and see what the other periods look like as well to make sure that from month to month, I'm delivering a better XLA because I know that if my users are having a better experience, they're likely to be much happier and more productive as they work through these services. So wrapping up, just want to spend a minute here in terms of a call to action. So we've got we've touched on many points of our Martello DEM solution around our ability to support the whole work from anywhere experience. And we would love if anybody has seen something in this webinar that they believe could help them in their environment, right? Users are complaining about a service issue and you don't know if it's specific to that user, or maybe there's many users that are impacted. We know that not every user is going to submit a ticket, so they might just be disgruntled or unproductive in silence. That's not something we want either. So, hopefully you saw something here that you believe could help the way that you're effectively dealing with Microsoft issues and of course with synthetics, hopefully staying ahead of it and being able to detect and fix problems before users even call and complain. So a couple options that we could do here. We could start a free trial of IQ or Gizmo, or just get a demo and see what this looks like and have the ability to ask our sales engineers some specific questions in terms of what this might look like in your environment. So with that said, we'll open up the floor to questions.
Well, thank you, Rob. We do have some questions that I will go right into. I'll just read these out and let either you or Olivier jump in on any of them. So the first one we have is, can Martello monitor the incidents published by Microsoft?
I can take that one. So yes, we definitely do. What we showed earlier, where you have access to the Service Health dashboard, are events that we retrieve in the Martello solutions. And the great thing is, not only will we retrieve it, but we're going to keep track of that. So historically, in what Rob mentioned in Martello IQ, you'll be able to go back in time and look at the incidents that have been open, and that helps you as well to correlate with the rest of the metrics that we're gathering, the rest of the events that you see. So when you're doing those post-mortem analysis, that allows you to, well, go back and look at everything that has taken place, even what Microsoft published.
Very good. The next question we have is, do you need to deploy agents on all user machines?
I can take that one. So the great thing about all the Teams call quality data that I was walking through with the specific user demo is it's completely agentless. So all the data that I showed in that demo was done without any agent or any software at all installed on any laptops, endpoints, anything like that. So it's really easy to on-ramp.
Very good. Next one is very interesting. Can you help getting Microsoft credits when there are outages?
That's a question we get often. And so it's not an easy yes and no answer. Yes, definitely we're going to help doing that, because if you look at the documentation, really what Microsoft recommends is that you get metrics, right? You need to be able to make a case and prove that there has been some impacts. So that's the great thing with the Martello solutions, is that you're going to have a set of data proving where there has been that impact, who has been impacted, and have metrics around that. And it's not going to be just like network metrics or pings. It's going to be exactly how long it took to access those metrics. And you have a baseline, so you can actually prove that this has changed from the baseline, and that would definitely help build your case when you reach out to Microsoft.
All right, we do have a couple more questions. We only have time for one more, though, because we do have another session coming up soon. So we did get a couple questions relating to how Martello is priced or licensed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can take that one. So it's licensed by Microsoft 365 user, and we've broken it down into a number of tiers. So depending on the sort of level where you are in terms of your desire to get the capabilities that you need, we have a few different editions that align to the level of functionality that you might be after. So, you know, starting out with just a few dollars per user, you can get many of the capabilities that we highlighted today.
All right, well, that is all the time we have, so we will have to wrap it up with that. And I just have to say that anybody that has spent any time in any size organization, whether on the user side or IT side, I think can certainly see the value of these tools. So I want to thank you, Olivier and Rob, for joining us today. And of course, we want to thank Martello for sponsoring today's focus session. And we want to thank all of our participants for attending. The next focus session will be starting very shortly. The link to join that session is provided in the email confirmation you received, and it's also available at the Twitter hashtag MS365Con. That's hashtag MS365Con if you don't have your email confirmation handy. That concludes this focus session. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you again very shortly.